A billionaire CEO offered a marriage contract to a humble cleaning woman who worked in his building at night. When she accepted out of desperation, neither of them imagined that cold agreement would transform into the truest love of their lives. Secrets came to light, families divided, and the fate of an empire ended up in the hands of the heart. A story of overcoming, redemption, and true love. Get ready, because this story will deeply touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. There are encounters born from silence, when defenses lower and the soul allows itself to be seen in its truest form. 3 in the morning had a particular sound in the Santoro corporate tower building. It wasn't exactly silence, but rather a symphony of small noises that only those who cleaned those empty corridors could appreciate. The distant hum of the air conditioning system, the rhythmic click of security lights, the sigh of wind against the 42nd floor windows. And that night, something else, a female voice singing an ancient melody, heartbreaking and beautiful. Mattias Santoro had returned to the office because he had forgotten crucial documents for the next morning's meeting. He didn't expect to find the main lights off, only the emergency ones creating long, dramatic shadows in the executive hall, and he definitely didn't expect to hear that voice. He stopped at the threshold, completely still, watching the woman scrubbing the Italian marble floor with precise circular movements, accompanying each gesture with a song that seemed to come directly from her heart. She wore the navy blue uniform of the cleaning company, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and sang as if she were alone in the entire world. The song spoke of mountains, of rivers seeking the sea, of impossible loves and dreams hiding on the horizon. Mattias, who had built an empire on cold numbers and calculated decisions, felt something break in his chest, a fissure in the armor he had worn for his 39 years. When she turned to wet the mop in the bucket again, their eyes met. The song cut off abruptly, as if someone had yanked a cable. The silence that followed was dense, charged with mutual surprise and something harder to name. "Mr. Santoro," she dropped the words with automatic respect, but there was dignity in her posture. "I didn't know you'd be coming tonight. I can return later to finish." "No." The response came out more abrupt than he intended. "Continue. I just came for some papers." But he didn't move. He stayed there, at the threshold between light and shadow, watching her with an intensity that made her feel vulnerable and strangely seen at the same time. She resumed her work, but the song had been extinguished, stored in some inner corner where no one else could reach it. Mattias finally walked toward his office, but his steps were slower than usual. Through the glass walls, he could continue watching her work, now in silence, and for the first time in years, he wondered about the lives of the people who kept his empire running while he slept. Who was she? What story did she carry in that voice that had transformed the loneliness of dawn into something sacred? When he left his office 15 minutes later, she was finishing polishing the wood of the conference table. She didn't sing, but her lips moved slightly as if the song continued within her, inaudible to the outside world. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself. She looked up, her honey-colored eyes reflecting the city lights shining behind the windows. "Luciana, sir, Luciana Mendes." "Your voice is extraordinary, Luciana." Her cheeks tinged with a faint pink, but she didn't lower her gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Santoro. My grandmother taught me those songs when I was a child. She says that singing while you work makes time pass differently, as if the effort transforms into something lighter." "Your grandmother is wise." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, full of unspoken things. Finally, Mattias nodded and headed toward the elevator. But before the doors closed, he looked back one last time. Luciana had resumed her work, but she wasn't singing, and he knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that he had ruined something precious by interrupting that moment of freedom. That night, in his luxury penthouse with panoramic views of the city, Mattias couldn't sleep. Luciana's voice resonated in his mind, mixing with the weight of the date that was inexorably approaching. His 40th birthday, the limit set by his grandfather to fulfill the marriage clause of the will. 6 months. He only had 6 months to find a wife or lose the inheritance he had worked for all his life. And while the city slept under a blanket of stars invisible due to light pollution, two people living in opposite worlds carried the weight of secrets that would soon collide in ways neither could foresee. Luciana Mendes's story wasn't extraordinary for her achievements, but for her persistence. Born in a small town hundreds of kilometers from the capital, she had grown up among cornfields and infinite skies, where her grandmother taught her that dignity isn't measured in possessions, but in the righteousness of the soul. At 18, when her father abandoned the family without explanations and her mother became seriously ill, Luciana made the decision that would define the rest of her life: leave behind her dreams of studying music and move to the city to work. 12 years later, at 30 years old, Luciana was a mosaic of contradictions. She worked 3 different jobs: night cleaning at Santoro Tower, waitress at a cafe during the mornings, and elderly caregiver on weekends. Every peso she earned was meticulously divided: 60% for her mother's medical treatments, 20% for rent on the small apartment she shared with her, 15% for food and basic necessities, and 5% for an emergency fund that never grew fast enough. Her reputation among her co-workers was legendary, though not always positively. They called her the stubborn one, because she never accepted help even when she clearly needed it. When Marta, her supervisor at the cleaning company, tried to offer her a loan for hospital bills, Luciana rejected it with a firm gentleness that admitted no discussion. "Don't offend me, Marta," she had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not one to borrow. I'll find a way." But the truth was more complex. Luciana didn't distrust generosity. She distrusted dependency. She had seen her mother wither waiting for her father to return, depositing her happiness in the hands of a man who never valued what he had. The lesson had been engraved in Luciana's soul with the precision of a scar. Never, ever would she allow her well-being to depend on another person. However, beneath that armor of fierce independence lived a woman of profound artistic sensitivity. The early mornings at Santoro Tower weren't just work for her. They were her sacred time, when she could sing without being judged, when she could dream of alternative lives while polishing the desks of executives who earned in a week what she did in a year. Sometimes, when she cleaned the main hall with its windows showing the sleeping city, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to wake up without the constant weight of worry, without counting every coin 3 times before spending it. The morning after the encounter with Matias Santoro, Luciana arrived at her shift at Café Horizontes with barely 3 hours of sleep. Her co-workers, accustomed to her perpetually tired face, didn't notice anything different. But Rosa, the cafe owner and a woman who had learned to read human hearts through 40 years of serving coffee, noticed that something had changed. "You have a different light today," Rosa commented while preparing a cappuccino. "Did something good happen?" Luciana shook her head, too quickly to be convincing. "Just tiredness, as always." But throughout her shift, her thoughts returned again and again to those grey eyes that had watched her in the darkness. The way Matias Santoro had said her name, as if it were something important, something worth remembering. The way his presence had filled the space not with arrogance, but with an intensity that suggested hidden depths. "It's dangerous," she warned herself while cleaning tables and automatically smiling at customers. "Men like him don't see women like me, and even if they did, I don't have time for fantasies." In the afternoon, when she visited her mother in their small apartment, she found the woman who once was her rock visibly weaker. Elena Mendes had turned 60 the previous month, but looked 80. The kidney disease that was slowly consuming her had transformed the vivacious woman who raised chickens and sang while cooking into a fragile shadow who could barely walk from the sofa to the kitchen without losing her breath. "Daughter," Elena said with a trembling voice as Luciana helped her sit down, "I received a letter from the hospital today." Luciana's heart stopped. Hospital letters never brought good news. What did it say? "There's a new treatment, experimental. They say it could stop the disease's progress, maybe even reverse some of the damage, but it costs." Elena closed her eyes, as if the figures caused her physical pain. "It costs more than you'll earn in 5 years, my girl. Luciana felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 5 years. 5 years of her life, of every hour worked, of every postponed dream, and still it wouldn't be enough. She sat next to her mother, taking those hands that once were strong and now seemed made of paper. "I'll find a way, Mom. I promise you." "No, Luciana. You can't sacrifice more than you've already given. You've given up so much for me, your dreams, your youth. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking anything," Luciana interrupted firmly. "You're my mother. This isn't sacrifice, it's love." But that night, alone in her small room with hospital bills scattered across the bed, Luciana allowed tears to fall for the first time in months. Tears of frustration, of fear, of exhaustion. She had promised her mother she would find a solution, but for the first time in her life, she had no idea how to keep that promise. And as she cried silently so as not to wake Elena, a voice inside her whispered dangerous questions. How far would she be willing to go to save her mother? What lines would she be willing to cross? What if the solution came from unexpected places? She had no answers. She only knew that the next day she would have to return to Santoro Tower, climb 42 floors, and clean the empire of a man who had probably already forgotten her name and her voice in the darkness. She was wrong. Mattia Santoro hadn't forgotten anything. Attorney Ricardo Valente's office occupied the 30th floor of a building that competed in height with Santoro Tower. Mattias entered the meeting with a tense jaw and hands in the pockets of his custom-made suit, a posture that Ricardo recognized as a sign of contained stress. "Mattias, thanks for coming," Ricardo, a 60-year-old man with silver hair and gold-framed glasses, pointed to one of the leather chairs. "We need to talk about the situation." "The situation," Mattias repeated with sarcasm, "is that my grandfather decided to control my life from the grave." "Your grandfather," Ricardo corrected with patience, "decided to ensure you built something more than a financial empire. He wanted you to have a family." "I'm 39 years old. I'm perfectly capable of deciding when and with whom to form a family." "You're 39 years old and have exactly 6 months to comply with the will's terms." Ricardo opened a thick folder on his desk. "The clause is clear. If you're not married before your 40th birthday, 70% of your grandfather's inheritance, including majority control of Santoro Enterprises, will be distributed among your cousins." Mattias stood up abruptly, walking toward the window that offered views of the city. From there he could see his own building, the empire he had doubled in size since assuming control a decade ago. Everything he had built, all the difficult decisions, sleepless nights, calculated risks, could evaporate due to an absurd clause. "My grandfather was senile when he wrote this." "Your grandfather was completely lucid," Ricardo responded firmly. "And if you want to challenge the will, you can try. But it will cost you years of legal battles and millions in fees. By the time you finish, if you win, the company will have suffered irreparable damage from the uncertainty." Mattias clenched his jaw. Ricardo was right. A public legal battle would destroy investor confidence, cause stock volatility, and his competitors would take advantage of the distraction to attack. No, he needed a more elegant solution. "What if I marry someone appropriate?" he asked, turning around. "Does the will specify how long I must remain married?" Ricardo hesitated, a gesture Mattias immediately caught. "Answer, Ricardo." "The original clause only mentions the marriage requirement before 40. "The original clause?" Another charged silence. "There's a second part that activates after the marriage, but I prefer to discuss that when it's relevant." "Tell me now." Ricardo sighed, removing his glasses to clean them meticulously, a delaying tactic Mattias recognized. "The second part states you must remain married for 5 years. If you divorce earlier, the inheritance is automatically distributed." The silence in the office became dense, heavy. Mattias felt as if the ground beneath his feet had transformed into quicksand. Not 6 months of theater, but 5 years. 5 years legally tied to someone. 5 years of pretending, of maintaining a farce. "This is insanity," he finally murmured. "This is the wish of a man who loved you, but who saw how you became colder, more isolated each year. Your grandfather believed money was consuming you, that you needed something real in your life." And he thought forcing me into a false marriage would create something real? He thought it would give you a reason to try. Matthias returned to his office 2 hours later, his head full of possibilities, all of them unpleasant. He could marry one of the women in his social circle, heiresses or businesswomen with their own interests at stake. A marriage of convenience between equals, without emotional expectations. But the idea turned his stomach. He had seen too many marriages like that, cold unions that resembled corporate mergers more than human connections. His younger brother, Sebastian, was waiting for him in his office, lounging on the leather sofa, with a glass of whiskey he had definitely taken from Matthias's private bar, without permission. "I heard you had an interesting meeting with old Ricardo," Sebastian said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Walls have ears in this family," Matthias responded, loosening his tie. "I don't need spies." "Your face says it all. Let me guess. The marriage clause is worse than you thought." Matthias didn't respond, pouring his own whiskey. "You know," Sebastian continued with a deliberately casual tone, "if you decide marriage isn't for you, there are other options. We could restructure the company, create a new division where you maintain operational control while the cousins handle." "No. Matthias, be reasonable. Marrying just for money goes against everything you—" I said no. Matthias's voice cut the air like a knife. "This empire isn't going to fragment because grandfather decided to play Cupid from beyond. I'll find a solution." "A temporary wife?" Sebastian suggested with sarcasm. "Are you going to place a classified ad? Woman sought willing to fake eternal love for financial benefits, acting experience preferable." The tension between the brothers was palpable. Sebastian, 3 years younger, had lived his entire life in the shadow of Matthias's achievements. While his older brother built empires, he managed secondary projects. While Matthias gained respect and fear in equal measure, Sebastian was seen as the CEO's fun brother. The Wills Clause didn't just threaten Matthias's power. It offered Sebastian the possibility of finally emerging from that shadow. "Leave, Sebastian." "Matthias, out of my office, now." When he was finally alone, Matthias sank into his chair, looking at the city through the windows. He had unlimited resources, powerful connections, a brilliant mind for business. But for the first time in his life, he faced a problem he couldn't solve with money or strategy. He needed something more elusive. He needed someone authentic, someone who wasn't contaminated by the greed of his social circle, someone who could maintain the farce without falling in love with what money could buy. And then, like a flash of light in the darkness, he remembered a voice singing in the early morning. He remembered honey-colored eyes that looked with dignity, despite the cleaning uniform. He remembered a woman who seemed to carry her own secrets with the same intensity he carried his. It was an absurd idea, ridiculous, completely improbable. But the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Someone from outside his world, someone who didn't know the rules of the social game in which he was trapped, someone who could remain invisible to the scrutinizing gazes of his family while they fulfilled the will's requirements. Matthias looked at the clock. Almost midnight. In 3 hours, Luciana Mendez would arrive at Santoro Tower for her night cleaning shift, and he would be there, waiting for her, with a proposal that would change both their lives forever. Luciana noticed the luxury car parked in front of the building when she arrived at 3 in the morning. A black Mercedes with tinted windows, the type of vehicle that screamed money and power. Her stomach tensed with a bad feeling as she swiped her access card and entered the silent lobby. The lights on the 42nd floor were on. They were never on at that hour. Luciana went up in the elevator with her heart beating faster than normal, mentally reviewing whether she had made any mistakes in her recent work. Had she accidentally broken something? Had some executive complained about the cleaning? When the elevator doors opened, she found Matthias Santoro standing by the window, looking at the sleeping city with his hands in his pockets. He wore the same suit as during the day, but his tie was loose and sleeves rolled up to his elbows, giving him an air of elegant exhaustion. "Mr. Santoro," Luciana said, staying at the elevator threshold, "is something wrong with my work?" He turned, and she saw that his grey eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Your work is impeccable, Luciana. I'm not here for that." "Then, why are you here?" Matthias crossed the space between them with deliberate steps, stopping at a distance that was professional but somehow felt intimate. "Because I have a proposal to make you, one that may sound completely absurd, but that will solve problems for both of us." Luciana frowned, her survival instincts immediately activating. She had heard stories of women in her position, proposals that seemed like solutions, but ended up being traps. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think we have the type of problems in common." A smile without humor touched Matthias's lips. "That's exactly what I thought until 2 days ago. But life has peculiar ways of creating intersections where they shouldn't exist." He took a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the nearest desk. "I know your mother is sick. I know you work 3 different jobs. I know the hospital bills are consuming every peso you earn, and that still it's not enough for the treatment she needs." The color drained from Luciana's face. A mixture of shame and fury lit her cheeks. "Have you been investigating me? How dare you?" "I have a massive inheritance pending," Matthias interrupted, his voice firm but not aggressive. "But to receive it, I need to be married before I turn 40. That gives me exactly 6 months." Luciana blinked, confused by the abrupt turn of the conversation. "I don't understand what that has to do with me." "I need a wife," Matthias said directly. "Not a real wife, not in the emotional sense. I need someone who will accept a temporary marriage contract, someone from outside my social circle who doesn't have hidden agendas or complicated family connections." The silence that followed was so profound that Luciana could hear her own heart beating in her ears. "You're joking." "I never joke about contracts." He opened the folder, revealing legal documents printed on expensive paper. 6 months of marriage. You'll live in my mansion, but you'll have your own private wing. We'll appear together at necessary family events. And in exchange, I'll pay you a sum that will completely cover your mother's treatment, plus an additional $1 million. Luciana felt her knees weaken. $1 million. It was a figure so abstract she couldn't process it. She could save her mother, pay all the debts, maybe even... No, the word left her mouth before her brain could fully process it. Matthias looked at her with genuine surprise. "No, I'm not going to sell myself in marriage like I'm a business transaction." Luciana lifted her chin, her eyes shining with determination. "No matter how much money you offer, I have principles." "Principles that your mother is paying for with her health," Matthias said, and though the words were harsh, his tone was strangely understanding. "That's cruel." "It's honest, Luciana. This isn't selling yourself. It's a mutual agreement. I need to comply with the terms of an absurd will. You need resources to save someone you love. There are no victims here, only 2 people finding a practical solution to complex problems." "And what happens after 6 months?" "We divorce amicably. I keep my inheritance. You have the resources to rebuild your life as you choose. Simple." But nothing in Matthias's eyes seemed simple. There were layers of complexity that Luciana could barely begin to decipher. "Why me?" she finally asked. "There must be hundreds of women in your social circle who would accept this without thinking twice. Precisely why I don't want them. They know the rules of the game, they know the gossip, family alliances have their own agendas. You are different." "Different as in desperate enough?" "Different as in authentic," Matthias corrected softly. "The other night when you were singing, you didn't know I was there. You were completely yourself, without masks. I haven't seen that in my world in, I don't remember how long." Luciana walked toward the window, needing space to think. The city stretched before her, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, each with their own invisible battles. "If I accept this," she said slowly, "I have conditions." Something changed in Matthias's posture, expectation, perhaps, or respect. "I'm listening. I continue working, not in this tower, but I keep my other jobs. I'm not going to become a kept woman. That will attract unwanted attention." "That's my condition," Luciana turned, facing him. "Either you accept it or there's no deal." "Agreed," Matthias consented after a pause. "Anything else?" "My mother can't know this is false. She's traditional. This would destroy her. So if we do this, you'll have to be convincing when you meet her." "Any other demands?" Luciana studied him carefully. There was something about this man that defied her expectations. She expected arrogance, but found something closer to controlled desperation. If at any moment I feel my dignity or safety are compromised, the agreement cancels immediately. Fair. Matthias extended his hand. Do we have a deal? Luciana looked at that hand, aware that shaking it would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't predict. She thought of her mother, of the sound of her labored breathing, of the hopelessness she had seen in her eyes when she spoke of the experimental treatment. Forgive me, Mum, she thought as she extended her own hand. Forgive me for having no other choice. Their hands met, the contact sending an electric current through both. The grip was firm, professional, but lasted a second longer than strictly necessary. We have a deal, Mr. Santoro. If we're going to be married, he said with an ironic smile, you should start calling me Matthias. And so, under the fluorescent lights of a corporate building at 3:30 in the morning, two strangers sealed an agreement that would make them legal spouses without really knowing anything about each other. They didn't know then that contracts written on paper are easy to fulfill, but contracts written on the heart are impossible to break. The Santoro mansion wasn't simply a house, it was a declaration of power. Located in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, behind high walls and automatic gates, the property occupied half a block. Modern architecture with classical touches, gardens designed by award-winning landscapers, a pool that seemed to merge with the horizon. When Luciana arrived for the first time, carrying her only suitcase and a bag with her most precious possessions, she felt she had crossed into a world where she didn't belong. Matthias received her at the main door, now dressed casually in jeans and a white linen shirt, a version of himself that seemed more human than the CEO in a suit. "Welcome," he said, and there was a strange tension in his voice, as if he too was aware of how surreal the situation was. "Let me show you your space." Luciana followed in silence as he guided her through hallways, adorned with contemporary art that probably cost more than everything she would earn in her lifetime. Her private wing turned out to be a complete suite, with bedroom, bathroom, living room, and balcony with views of the gardens. "It's too much," she murmured, touching the silk of the curtains with reverence. "It's appropriate," Matthias corrected. "You'll be my wife in the world's eyes. You can't live in a closet." "But we're not really." "The world doesn't know that," he interrupted gently. "And it can't know. Especially my family. They're complicated." During the following week, Luciana quickly learned what complicated meant. Matthias's mother, Adriana Santoro, arrived unannounced 3 days after the private civil marriage they had performed in a government office, with only 2 hired witnesses. Adriana was a 65-year-old woman who wore her age with the grace of someone who had never had to worry about money. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and a gaze that evaluated and calculated in milliseconds. "So you're the mysterious wife," she said, studying Luciana from head to toe while they had tea in the main living room. "Matthias has been terribly secretive about you. Mum, I asked you to call before coming," Matthias said, with barely contained tension. "And I asked you to introduce me to your wife before marrying, but we both have our disappointments." Adriana smiled, but it was a smile with teeth. "So, Luciana, tell me about your family. Where do you come from?" Luciana felt the trap in the question. She had rehearsed her backstory with Matthias, but being in front of this sophisticated woman, in this house that seemed out of a magazine, made all her prepared answers sound false in her own mind. "I grew up in the countryside," she responded honestly. "My mother and grandmother raised me after my father left us. It's not a glamorous story, Mrs. Santoro." She expected disapproval, disdain, perhaps. What she received was something completely different, genuine interest. "The best stories rarely are," Adriana said, leaning forward. "And how did you meet my son?" This was the delicate part. Luciana and Matthias had agreed on a version that contained elements of truth, but omitted the crucial. They had met when she worked in the building. He had noticed her and been intrigued by her authenticity. He had invited her to dinner, and the rest had been a romantic whirlwind. But as she told this sanitized version, Luciana noticed Adriana watching her with eyes that were too perceptive. This woman had navigated complex social circles for decades. She knew how to recognize a lie when she heard it. Fascinating, Adriana murmured when Luciana finished. My son, known for his calculated coldness, swept away by a whirlwind romance. It almost sounds like a fairy tale. Mom, Matthias warned. I'm not being cruel, dear. I'm being realistic. She stood up, smoothing her impeccable skirt. Luciana, I must tell you that many women have tried to capture my son's attention over the years. Beautiful, educated women from appropriate families. They all failed. I didn't capture him, Luciana said, finding her voice. I'm not a hunter and he's not prey. We simply found each other. Something changed in Adriana's expression. The hardness in her eyes softened slightly. Interesting, she finally said. Very interesting. Perhaps there's more to this story than meets the eye. After Adriana left, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and unanswered questions, Luciana collapsed on the sofa. Your mother knows something doesn't add up. My mother always knows when something doesn't add up. Matthias poured himself a whiskey, offering her one that she declined. But she can't prove anything, and as long as we keep the story consistent, it doesn't matter what she suspects. Doesn't this bother you? Lying to your own mother? Matthias was silent for a long moment, looking at the amber liquid in his glass. My mother has lived in a world of elegant lies her entire life. Marriages of convenience, friendships of convenience, everything measured and calculated. If this particular lie bothers her, it will only be because she didn't design it herself. The bitterness in his voice surprised Luciana. For the first time, she glimpsed the complexities of the family she had married into. The power dynamics and expectations that had formed the man who was now technically her husband. Is that why you accepted the clause? She asked softly. For the inheritance? I accepted the clause because my grandfather built that empire from scratch, and I doubled it, Matthias responded with intensity. I'm not going to lose it to the greed of cousins who never worked a single day in their lives. But also, he hesitated, also because I wanted to prove I can do this my way, that I can comply with the rules without completely betraying who I am. And who are you, Matthias Santoro? He looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed to expose vulnerability. I'm still trying to figure that out. That night, Luciana lay awake in her luxurious suite, so different from the small mattress in her old apartment that her body didn't know how to relax in such comfort. She had sent the first large payment to the clinic, securing her mother's treatment. Elena had cried with relief and joy when she received the news, completely believing the love marriage story Luciana had woven. What I'm doing is right, she told herself in the darkness. I'm saving Mom. That justifies everything else. But somewhere deep in her consciousness, a voice whispered that some lies, no matter how well-intentioned, have ways of growing until they consume the truth that once justified them. In his own wing of the mansion, Matthias also remained awake, thinking about the woman who now bore his surname without really knowing him. He had assumed 6 months would be easy to endure, two strangers sharing a space with clear goals and defined boundaries. He didn't anticipate how her voice in the darkness that day had left a mark on his memory. He didn't anticipate that each interaction would reveal layers of complexity that challenged his assumptions. He didn't anticipate that he would start looking for excuses to be in the same room as her, just to see how the evening light illuminated her face while she read in the garden. It's just curiosity, he told himself, novelty. It will pass. But somewhere deep in his chest, where uncomfortable truths live and wait to be acknowledged, he knew something had begun to change. Something that wasn't in the contract, something money couldn't buy nor lawyers draft, something dangerous, something real. The first public event as a married couple was a charity gala at the city's most prestigious hotel. Luciana prepared in her suite with trembling hands, looking at the dress Matthias had sent, a midnight blue silk creation that probably cost more than 3 months of her old salary. When she descended the stairs, she found Matthias waiting for her in the foyer, impeccable in a tuxedo. But what captured her attention was the expression on his face when he saw her. Genuine surprise followed by something deeper that disappeared before she could name it. "You're—" he began, then stopped, as if the right words escaped him. "Too much? Not convincing?" Luciana asked with insecurity. "Beautiful," he finished simply. "You're beautiful, Luciana." The car ride was tense with the type of electricity that only exists between two people striving to maintain distance while physically close. Matthias gave her final instructions, names of important people to remember, safe conversation topics, how to handle indiscreet questions. And if someone asks how we fell in love, she asked, tell them it was gradual, that I noticed your intelligence and spirit before noticing anything else, that you challenged me in ways no one else dared. Luciana glanced at him sideways. That sounds almost true. The best lies always are. The gala was a parallel universe of opulence. Crystal chandeliers, live orchestra, tables covered with linen tablecloths and flower centerpieces that cost more than a month's food for a family. Luciana felt every eye in the hall fixed on her when they entered together, Matthias's arm firm under hers. Relax, he murmured near her ear. You're my wife. You have as much right to be here as anyone. But that was precisely the problem. She didn't have that right. She was an intruder, an actress playing a role she had never auditioned for, surrounded by people whose lives seemed to exist in a completely different dimension from hers. The first challenge came when a corpulent executive, with breath of cigar and expensive whiskey, approached with his wife, a woman with more plastic surgeries than natural wrinkles. "Santoro, I can't believe you finally got married," he exclaimed, giving Matthias a back slap that seemed too strong to be friendly. "And this must be the mysterious lady. My wife and I have been wondering where you came from, dear." Luciana felt the edge beneath the polite words. Where you came from was code for you're not from our world. From the countryside, she responded with her head high. My roots are in the land and hard work, not in halls like this. The executive's wife subtly choked on her champagne. Her husband blinked, unsure whether he had been insulted or not. "How refreshing," he finally said. "And tell me, what did your parents do?" "My mother is a housewife. My father abandoned us when I was a child." The uncomfortable silence stretched. Matthias, who had been watching with growing fascination, intervened. "Luciana is the most authentic person I've met. She has no time for social games or empty conversations. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with her." The intensity with which he said it, as if it weren't completely acting, made Luciana look at him in surprise. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the lie felt dangerously close to something true. The rest of the evening was a blur of similar encounters. Luciana made countless social mistakes, used the wrong fork, didn't recognize an exclusive cultural reference, and in one memorable moment, confused a senator with a waiter. Each slip made her feel more exposed, more out of place. But strangely, Matthias never corrected her in public. Instead, he seemed to find genuine amusement in her mistakes, as if each one were an act of rebellion against the artificial world surrounding him. The critical moment came during dinner. The topic drifted to business, specifically about the challenges of maintaining quality standards in the service industry. A rival company CEO casually commented on how it was impossible to find good workers these days. "People no longer have work ethic," he declared, cutting his filet mignon. "They want everything handed to them without effort." Luciana felt her blood boil. She thought of her 3 jobs, of the early mornings cleaning while others slept, of every sore muscle and silent sacrifice she had made for years. "With due respect," she said, her voice louder than she intended, "maybe the problem isn't lack of work ethic, but lack of decent wages. It's hard to have passion for work when you can't pay rent." The entire table fell silent. The CEO looked at her with the kind of disdain reserved for those who challenge the established order. "Clearly you don't understand how business works, dear." "I understand how survival works," Luciana responded, "something you may have forgotten from your office on the 40th floor. Matthias, who had been drinking water, almost choked. The rest of the table seemed petrified between discomfort and astonishment. Sebastian, Matthias's younger brother, who had been watching from across the table, smiled with genuine joy at the chaos. "I like you, sister-in-law," he said, raising his glass. "Finally someone who tells these pretentious people truths." The tension exploded into uncomfortable laughter, but the damage was done. Luciana had exposed that she didn't belong to that world, that she was a stranger pretending to be something she wasn't. On the way back in the car, she expected a scolding. Instead, Matthias took off his tie with a sigh that sounded strangely close to relief. "I thought you'd be furious," she murmured. "Furious?" He turned to her with an expression hard to read. "Luciana, that was the first honest dinner I've had in years. Every word you said was true, and they knew it. That's why they reacted so defensively. But I ruined everything. Now they know I'm not from their world." "You didn't ruin anything. You reminded them that there's a world beyond their privilege bubbles," he paused. "My grandfather would have been proud." Something in the way he said it, with a mixture of sadness and admiration, made Luciana see him in a different light. This man who had built empires, who navigated power circles with apparent ease, carried his own weight of expectations and masks. "Was your grandfather different? From them, I mean." "He was a man who started with nothing and built everything from scratch," Matthias responded. "He never forgot his roots, even when his bank account had more zeros than he could count. He always said true character is shown not in how you treat your superiors, but in how you treat those who can give you nothing in return." "He sounds like a good man." He was, and he would have seen through this marriage of convenience in a second. Matthias smiled with irony, probably why he included that damned clause. He knew his grandson too well. They arrived at the mansion in a silence that felt less uncomfortable than contemplative, but before Luciana could get out of the car, Matthias spoke again. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being yourself, even when it would have been easier to pretend. For reminding me there are still people in the world who value truth more than convenience." Their eyes met in the car's penumbra, and Luciana felt something move in her chest, something nameless but dangerously close to real connection. 6 months, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Just 6 months, and this ends." 6 months, Matthias repeated, but there was something in his tone that sounded less like a reminder and more like a question. That night, as Luciana removed the expensive dress and put on her simple nightgown, she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because of the traces of makeup or elegant hairstyle, but because of something in her eyes, a spark of something that looked dangerously like hope. "No," she warned herself firmly, "you can't afford hope. This is a contract, a business agreement. In 6 months you'll return to your life and he to his, as if none of this happened." But even as she told herself this, she knew it was already too late. The cracks in the facade of the false marriage had begun to appear, and through those cracks something real threatened to grow. The 2nd month of the marriage arrived, with a routine that was strangely comfortable and deeply uncomfortable at the same time. Luciana had maintained her job at Café Horizontes, and each morning she left the mansion dressed in her simple uniform under an expensive coat Matthias had insisted on buying her. He never mentioned her work, but she noticed how his eyes followed her figure when she left, an indecipherable expression on his face. In the afternoons, when both were home, they had fallen into an unplanned pattern. She read in the library while he worked in his home office, and around 9 at night, without prior words, both ended up in the kitchen. Matthias made coffee, Luciana made sandwiches, and they talked about everything and nothing. Politics, philosophy, childhood memories, abandoned dreams. Those nightly conversations became the hidden heart of the false marriage, a space where masks could come down and two lonely people could simply be human together. But everything changed the night the article arrived. Luciana was helping at the cafe when her phone exploded with notifications. Rosa, the owner, handed her a tablet with a worried expression. The screen showed an article from a gossip magazine. "Marriage of convenience, Santoro magnate's secret wife still works as waitress." There were photos of her serving coffee, in simple clothes with her hair tied back, accompanied by photos from the gala where she looked like a princess. The contrast was deliberately grotesque. The article openly speculated, why did the richest man in the city's new wife keep working in a cafe? Was it a farce? A gold digger who had infiltrated the Santoro family? Or simply a desperate woman willing to do anything for money? Luciana felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the cafe filled with stares, some customers recognizing her from the photos, others whispering behind their hands. Rosa touched her shoulder gently. "Go home, daughter. Handle this before it gets worse." When Luciana arrived at the mansion, she found Matthias in his office, surrounded by newspapers and his assistant, talking rapidly about damage control and press releases. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time since they met, she saw something close to panic in his eyes. "Luciana, I didn't." "Did you know they were watching me?" she interrupted, her voice trembling. "Did you know there were photographers following me?" "No." Matthias stood up, gesturing for his assistant to leave. "I swear, I had no idea. I was careless. I should have anticipated the press would be interested. They say I'm a gold digger, that I'm using you, that all of this is a lie." "It is a lie," Matthias said with bitterness. "That's the irony. They're reaching the right conclusion for the wrong reasons." Luciana sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I can't continue with this. My mother is seeing these news reports. My friends are seeing these news reports. Everyone thinks I sold my soul for money. And didn't you?" The silence that followed was brutal. Matthias immediately realized his mistake, but the words were already out, poisoning the air between them. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean—" "But you said it." Luciana stood up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And you're right. That's exactly what I did. I sold my dignity for my mother's treatment, and now the whole world knows it." "Luciana, wait." But she was already leaving, climbing the stairs to her suite with steps that echoed in the empty mansion. Matthias followed her, his own guilt transforming into something more complicated when he caught up with her in the hallway. "You didn't sell your soul," he said firmly. "You saved your mother. Those are two completely different things." "Are they?" She turned to him. "Because from where I'm standing, they look suspiciously similar. You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Matthias took a step closer, his voice charged with emotions neither was ready to name. "I see someone who worked 3 jobs without complaining. Someone who sings songs of hope while cleaning empty buildings. Someone who prefers her own working hands to charity. I see courage. Luciana, not cowardice." She looked at him, confused by the intensity in his words. "You don't know me well enough to see those things." "I know you better than you think," he responded softly, "and definitely better than I knew the women I was supposedly supposed to marry. They would have told me what I wanted to hear. You tell me what I need to hear. There's a difference." The space between them seemed charged with electricity. Luciana was painfully aware of how close they were, how the hallway light created shadows on Matthias's face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "This marriage is going to destroy both our reputations," she murmured. "Let reputations rot," Matthias responded with a ferocity that surprised her. "In 2 months, you've challenged me more than anyone in my life. You've made me laugh, made me think, made me question everything I thought I knew about what's important. If that's what I get in exchange for some gossip magazine covers, it's a low price." Luciana felt her determination waver. This wasn't the plan. He wasn't supposed to say things that made her heart race. She wasn't supposed to start looking forward to their nightly conversations more than anything else in her day. "Matthias," she began, not knowing how to finish the sentence. He raised his hand, almost touching her cheek, but stopping at the last moment. "Tell me you feel it too," he murmured. "This thing between us. Tell me I'm not the only one starting to forget where the acting ends and reality begins." Luciana's heart beat so hard, she was sure he could hear it. All her defenses screamed at her to step away, to remember this was temporary, that in 4 months everything would end and she would return to her real life. But her heart, that traitorous organ, wanted to lean into the warmth Matthias offered. "I can't," she finally whispered. "I can't afford to feel this." "Why not?" "Because when it ends, when this contract expires and we become strangers again, it will destroy me. And I've been destroyed before, Matthias. I won't survive a second time." He saw the impact of her words on his face, the way something broke behind his grey eyes. "What if it didn't end?" he asked quietly. "What if we found a way to make this real?" "There's no such way." Luciana took a step back, needing space to think. "We live in different worlds. I serve coffee, you run empires. I count every peso. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. This isn't a Cinderella story, Matthias. It's a business agreement that's getting complicated. Maybe it's supposed to get complicated. Or maybe it's supposed to end before we both get hurt. The silence between them was dense with everything unsaid. Finally, Matthias nodded slowly, stepping back. "You're right. I'm confusing proximity with connection, convenience with compatibility. I apologize if I made you uncomfortable." But there was pain in his voice, pain that echoed what Luciana felt in her own chest. "You didn't make me uncomfortable," she admitted quietly. "You made me feel things I promised never to feel again, and that scares me more than I can express." They looked at each other, two people trapped in a marriage that was supposed to be false, but felt increasingly real with each passing day. Luciana saw the moment Matthias made a decision, the way his expression closed, the walls going back up. "I'll keep my distance from now on," he said formally. "No more nightly conversations, no more blurred lines. We'll fulfill the contract professionally until it ends." It was the right thing, the sensible thing. So why did it feel like a door closing on something that could have been beautiful? "That's for the best," Luciana agreed, her voice barely a whisper. Matthias turned to leave but stopped at the threshold. "For what it's worth," he said without looking at her, "these have been the best 10 weeks of my life. No matter how this ends, I don't regret it." And then he was gone, leaving Luciana alone in the hallway, with silent tears running down her cheeks, and the certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. She had built her entire life on the principle of not depending on anyone, of keeping her heart safe behind walls of fierce independence. But walls don't stop pain. They only contain it, concentrating it until it becomes unbearable. That night, for the first time since moving into the mansion, Luciana allowed the sobs to come out freely. She cried for her mother, for the sacrifices she had made, for the dreams she had buried. She cried for the false marriage that had felt more real than any relationship she'd had. And she cried because, somewhere between the nightly conversations and stolen glances, she had made the cardinal mistake. She had begun to fall in love with Matthias Santoro. And love, as she had learned painfully in her youth, always ended in loss. Scene Part 1 completed, awaiting command to continue Part 2. The following 2 weeks were an elegant torture. Matthias and Luciana moved through the mansion like ghosts, avoiding each other with a precision that was only possible when two people are painfully aware of each other's presence. Breakfasts became asynchronous, dinners non-existent, nightly conversations replaced by silences that resonated louder than any words. The family noticed the change immediately. Adriana, with her hawk-like social eyes, called her son to the family mansion for an intimate lunch that Matthias knew was really an interrogation. "You're distancing yourselves," Adriana declared without preamble, cutting her salad with precise movements. "Newlywed couples should be in their honeymoon phase, not living like strangers under the same roof. It's none of your business, Mom." "Everything affecting this family is my business," she responded firmly, "especially when it involves your grandfather's inheritance and a marriage that from the beginning seemed hasty." Matthias clenched his jaw, preparing for the verbal attack he knew was coming. "What do you want me to say, that I made a mistake? That I married for the wrong reasons?" "I want you to tell the truth." Adriana put down her utensils, looking at her son with a mixture of frustration and genuine concern. "Matthias, I've seen you in dozens of superficial relationships over the years, beautiful, intelligent, appropriate women, and none touched your heart. But this girl, this woman who comes from nowhere with her fierce dignity and her complete indifference to our wealth, has devastated you in 2 months. She hasn't devastated me. You're losing weight. Your assistant says you work until 3 in the morning. And when you came to dinner last week, you didn't mention her once. That's not the behavior of a man in a happy marriage. It's the behavior of a man running from something that scares him." The problem with Adriana Santoro was that, beneath all her layers of social sophistication and elegant manipulation, she was fundamentally insightful about human nature. "She's complicating things," Matthias finally admitted. "It was supposed to be simple, an agreement, clear terms, a clean ending. But nothing about her is simple." "Do you love her?" The question fell between them like a bomb. Matthias froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips. "I don't know her well enough to love her." "That's not what I asked." Matthias was silent for a long moment, watching the red wine swirl in his glass. I don't know what I feel. I only know that when she's not around, the world seems grayer, that her conversations challenge me more than any business negotiation, that the way she sings when she thinks no one's listening is the most beautiful sound I've heard, and that the idea that in 4 months she'll leave and I'll never see her again makes me feel like I'm losing something I never knew I needed. Adriana studied her son with eyes that suddenly seemed softer. Then you're in serious trouble, my boy. I know. And what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Matthias set down his glass too hard. She made it clear this is temporary, that we live in different worlds, that she can't afford feelings, and she's right. When the contract ends, she'll return to her life and I to mine. And all of this will have been an interesting aberration in our otherwise separate existences. Matthias Santoro, Adriana said with a firmness that instantly transported him to his childhood. Your grandfather didn't raise you to be a coward. If you want that woman, fight for her. And if you don't want her, let her go properly. But this limbo you're living is cruel to you both. His mother's words resonated in Matthias's mind throughout the drive back. She was right, as always. But the problem wasn't lack of courage, it was lack of certainty. How could he fight for something when he didn't even know if the other side wanted to be won? Meanwhile, Luciana faced her own demons. Her mother, whose treatment had begun with promising results, noticed the sadness in her daughter's eyes during a visit. You're not happy, Elena observed with the clarity only mothers possess. I'm fine, Mom. You're lying, and you do it terribly. Elena took her daughter's hand. Is it because of Matthias? Luciana didn't trust her voice, so she simply nodded. Does he treat you badly? No, he's perfect, actually. That's part of the problem. Elena frowned, confused. Explain to me how a perfect husband is a problem. Because it wasn't supposed to be real. The words escaped before Luciana could stop them. The silence that followed was dense. Elena studied her daughter's face, reading the layers of meaning behind that fragmented confession. Oh, my girl, she finally sighed. You've fallen in love with your own husband, and it terrifies you because it means you have something to lose. The tears Luciana had been holding back finally overflowed. I can't afford to lose him, Mum. I've already lost so much. Dad, my dreams, years of my life working just to survive. If I allow myself to love Matthias and he leaves like everyone leaves, there won't be enough pieces of me left to pick up. Elena drew her daughter into her embrace, stroking her hair as when she was a child. My love, you've spent so much time protecting yourself from pain that you forgot how to live with joy. Your father left us, it's true, and that was his failure, not yours. But if you let that fear dictate the rest of your life, then he wins anyway. Don't give him that power. What if I get hurt again? What if you don't? Elena responded softly. What if this time, just this once, someone stays? Isn't the risk worth it? Luciana left that visit with her heart heavier and lighter at the same time. Her mother had named the truth she had been avoiding. She was in love with Matthias Santoro. Completely, irrevocably, dangerously in love. And she had no idea what to do about it. The universe, however, had its own plans. 3 days later, Matthias's most important partner, Eduardo Rios, insisted on meeting with him and Luciana to meet the famous wife. The appointment was at an exclusive restaurant, the type of place where the silence between each course was enough for uncomfortable conversations to resonate. Eduardo turned out to be a 50-year-old man with a shark smile and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. So, Luciana, he said after they ordered, Matthias tells me you still work. How quaint. Eduardo, Matthias warned. No, it's fascinating. In my 30 years in business, I've never seen a CEO's wife serve coffee in the mornings. There must be an interesting story there. Luciana felt the trap in his words, but she also felt something else. Weariness. Weariness of pretending, of defending herself, of living in two worlds and not fully belonging to either. The story is simple, she responded calmly. I work because I like to work, because I spent my whole life building my independence, and I'm not ready to give it up. Not even for a marriage. If that seems quaint to you, then maybe your world needs more color. Eduardo blinked, clearly not expecting that direct response. Matthias, who had been tense all evening, suddenly smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "That's why I married her," he said, looking at Luciana with an intensity that left her breathless. "Because she's real in a world of performances. Because she challenges expectations without apologizing. Because she reminds me every day that there's more to life than bank accounts and business deals." Eduardo studied them both with narrowed eyes. "You know, Matthias, when I heard about your sudden marriage, I assumed it was for the will clause, a strategic move like everything you do. But looking at you now," he paused significantly, "maybe there's something more here than I thought." Dinner continued with a slightly less tense atmosphere, but when Eduardo excused himself to take a call, Matthias and Luciana were left alone in a bubble of uncomfortable silence. "Thank you," Matthias finally said, "for standing up for yourself, for being you." "I'm tired of being someone else," Luciana admitted quietly. "These 2 months have been the strangest of my life, playing a role, living a lie, but feeling more myself than I have in years." "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For putting you in this position, for being the reason you have to lie every day." Luciana looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the guilt etched in every line of his face. "Matthias, I accepted this agreement with open eyes. No one forced me. And if I'm honest, I don't regret it, not even with everything that's become complicated." "You don't?" "No, because it showed me a world I never would have seen. It taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, and it gave me the opportunity to save my mother. That's worth all the lies and all the press articles." Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, the elegant restaurant disappeared. Only they existed, two people trapped in an impossible marriage that felt increasingly necessary. "Luciana," Matthias began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I need to tell you something." But Eduardo returned at that moment, breaking the spell. And the opportunity, like so many before, was lost in the noise of the world around them. That night, however, something had changed. When they arrived home, neither immediately retired to their separate wings. Instead, by tacit agreement, they ended up in the library, fire crackling in the fireplace, a bottle of wine between them. "What were you going to say?" Luciana asked softly. "At the restaurant, before Eduardo came back." Matthias looked at the fire for a long moment before responding. "I was going to tell you that these have been the worst and best 2 months of my life. Worst because I discovered something I thought I could control slipped out of my hands. Best because I finally understand what my grandfather wanted me to find. Someone who challenges me to be better than I am." "Your grandfather was wise." "He was manipulative," Matthias corrected with an ironic smile, "but he was also wise. And I think somehow he knew I needed someone exactly like you in my life." "Matthias." "No, let me finish." He leaned forward. "I know this was supposed to be temporary. I know we agreed to keep distance. But I'm tired of lying, especially to myself. These feelings I have for you aren't convenient or professional or part of any contract. They're real and terrifying and completely unsolicited. But they're mine, and I need you to know." Luciana's heart beat so hard she thought it would leap out of her chest. All her defenses, all the carefully constructed reasons why this was a bad idea, crumbled in front of the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I feel them too," she whispered, "and I'm terrified too." "Of what?" "That when this ends, I won't remember how to live without you." Matthias stood up, crossing the space between them, kneeling in front of her chair until their eyes were level. "Then let's not end it. The contract. To hell with the contract. We can write a new one, a real one. One where there's no expiration date or business terms, just two people choosing each other every day. Your family, your world, will never truly accept me. My world can adapt, and if it can't, we'll build a new one." Luciana touched his face with trembling hands, tracing the line of his jaw, memorizing every detail. "Are you sure about this? Once we cross this line, there's no going back." "I've been sure since the night I heard you singing in the darkness," he responded, covering her hand with his. "It just took me 2 months to have the courage to admit it." And finally, without contracts or expectations or audiences, Matthias and Luciana kissed. It wasn't like in the movies, perfect and choreographed. It was clumsy and tentative. Two people learning each other's language, stumbling on the way to something beautiful. When they separated, both were smiling, eyes bright with unshed tears. "So, what do we do now?" Luciana asked. "Now," Matthias said, standing and extending his hand, "we start over. No lies, no performances, just you and me building something real." She took his hand, allowing him to help her up. And in that simple gesture, both felt the world's weight shift. They were no longer two strangers pretending to be married. They were two people choosing, against all odds and expectations, to build a life together. But the universe rarely allows love stories to be simple. And the next test they would face would put everything they had built in danger. The third month of the marriage dawned with equal parts promises and dangers. Matthias and Luciana had found a new rhythm, one based on honesty instead of performance. They had breakfast together, their conversations flowing from trivial topics to deep philosophies. He accompanied her to the cafe some mornings, sitting in a corner with his laptop while she worked, just to be near. She attended his business meetings when he considered them important, offering perspectives that consistently surprised his partners with their practical clarity. But Sebastian, the younger brother, watched these developments with growing alarm. The inheritance that once seemed within his grasp now seemed firmly in Matthias's hands. More disturbing still, the marriage he had assumed was a farce was clearly transforming into something real. Desperate and consumed by envy, Sebastian hired a private investigator, not to find secrets about Luciana, those he already knew, but to find irrefutable proof that the marriage had begun as fraud, thus violating the will's terms. What the investigator discovered was even better. Bank documents showing the massive money transfer to Luciana's account days after the civil marriage. Hospital receipts in Elena Mendez's name, paid in full by Matthias Santoro. And the most damning detail, records showing Luciana was still employed as a cleaner at Santoro Tower, until exactly 1 week before the marriage. Sebastian presented this information to his mother and influential uncles during a casual family meeting he had convened under false pretenses. Matthias arrived late, Luciana with him, and they found the room full of faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. "What is this?" Matthias asked, tension immediately evident in his posture. "This," Sebastian responded, "distributing folders with documents, is the truth about your convenient marriage." The color drained from Luciana's face when she recognized the papers. Matthias, however, remained perfectly still, his expression transforming into the cold, calculating mask he used in difficult negotiations. "Continue," he said with a dangerously quiet voice. "With pleasure." Sebastian stood up, playing to the audience. "Your wife worked cleaning your offices. Literally and figuratively, she scrubbed your floors. And days after a sudden, secret marriage, she received a money transfer sufficient to pay massive medical debts. Want to explain how that's not a bought and paid for marriage?" The silence in the room was absolute. The uncles murmured among themselves. Matthias's mother looked at her son with an impossible-to-read expression. "It's true," Matthias said simply. The murmurs turned into exclamations of surprise. Sebastian smiled triumphantly. "So you admit you bought a wife to comply with the will clause?" "I admit," Matthias continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife, "that when I met Luciana, she worked in my building. I admit I discovered her mother was sick. And I admit I offered financial help after our marriage." "See," Sebastian exclaimed, "it's fraud." "I haven't finished." Matthias's voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity. "Yes, our marriage began unconventionally. Yes, there were financial terms involved. But what my brother and his carefully compiled documents can't capture is what happened after. They can't quantify the midnight conversations where we discovered we shared the same wounds. They can't measure the laughter, the challenges, the moments of vulnerability where two lonely people found mutual understanding." He turned to Luciana, taking her hand in front of the entire family. "Yes, our marriage began as a transaction, but it became something much bigger than any contract we signed. It became the realest thing I've experienced in my life." Adriana Santoro, who had been silent until that moment, stood up. "Sebastian, out. Now." "Mom, I'm exposing fraud." "You're exposing your own greed," Adriana replied with coldness, "and your complete lack of understanding about what's important. Out. Sebastian," humiliated publicly and financially defeated by legal fees, left with a slam of the door. The uncles, reading the room, also began retreating with uncomfortable murmurs about private family matters. When the room finally had only Adriana, Matthias, and Luciana, the matriarch approached the couple. "Did you know?" she asked her son. "When you made the proposal, did you know you were falling in love with her?" "No," Matthias responded honestly. "I thought I could control my feelings. I was wrong." Adriana then turned to Luciana, studying her with eyes that had seen decades of social masks and elegant lies. "And you, girl, do you love my son or just love what he can give you?" Luciana, who had been silent during the entire exchange, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Santoro, before meeting Matthias, I survived on 3 jobs and 5 hours of sleep. I paid every peso of debt myself, without asking for help. If I wanted money for money's sake, I would have found easier ways to get it than marrying a man who challenges me, frustrates me, and makes me want to be better every day." She paused, tears threatening but not falling. "I love your son not despite his complications, but because of them. Because beneath all the expensive suits and business decisions, I found a man who sings badly in the shower, who worries too much about doing the right thing, and who looks at me as if I were more valuable than any inheritance he could gain or lose. And the inheritance doesn't matter to me," Matthias added. "If I lose everything tomorrow, if Sebastian wins, if the uncles decide this marriage invalidates the terms, I don't care, because I already won the only thing that matters." Adriana studied them both for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. "Your grandfather would be so insufferably smug right now," she said. "He always said he knew what you needed better than you yourself." She approached and, to everyone's surprise, hugged Luciana. "Welcome to the family, my girl, the real one this time, not the acting version." When Adriana left, Matthias and Luciana were left alone in the living room, processing what had just happened. "Your brother isn't going to let this go," Luciana said. "I know, but I don't care anymore. The worst secret is out. There's nothing left to hide." "Except one thing." Luciana took his hand. "The second clause. Ricardo mentioned it, remember? The one that activates after the marriage." Matthias's face went pale. "We don't have to worry about that yet." "What does it say, Matthias?" "Luciana. We deserve complete honesty," she insisted. "After everything we've been through, I need to know everything." Matthias exhaled slowly, defeated. "It says we must remain married for 5 years. If we divorce before, the entire inheritance goes to charity." Luciana felt the world tilt. 5 years, and you didn't tell me?" "Because it didn't matter. At first it was just a future problem, and after everything became real, I thought maybe it wouldn't be a problem at all." "But it is." Luciana stepped away, needing space. "Because now there will always be this question in the back of my mind. Do you love me, or do you need me to keep your inheritance?" "I love you," Matthias said fiercely. "The inheritance can go to hell." "Then renounce it," Luciana challenged. "If it really doesn't matter, renounce it now. Let's divorce. Let Sebastian and the cousins divide the money, and see if what we have survives without that weight hanging over us." The challenge hung in the air between them. Matthias wanted to say yes immediately, to prove his feelings were real. But something stopped him, a complex truth that was hard to articulate. "I can't," he finally admitted. "Why not?" "Because it's not just money. That empire employs 8,000 people. Their families depend on those salaries. If I abandon it, if I let it fragment among cousins who only see numbers on spreadsheets, I'm betraying my grandfather's trust and putting thousands of lives at risk." "Then you're trapped," Luciana said sadly, "and by extension so am I." "You're not trapped. You can leave any time. And destroy everything you worked for. Make you lose not only the inheritance but everything you built." She shook her head. "No, that's not really an option, is it?" They looked at each other across the space that suddenly seemed unbridgeable. "What do we do now?" Matthias asked quietly. "Honestly, I don't know," Luciana responded, "but I need time to think, alone." That night, for the first time since they had allowed themselves to be honest about their feelings, they slept in separate wings of the mansion, and both lay awake, staring at different ceilings, wondering if love was enough to overcome the complications surrounding it. Sometimes loving someone means facing uncomfortable truths, and the most uncomfortable truth of all was this. They had built something beautiful on a foundation of lies, and now they had to decide if that something could bear the weight of complete reality. 3 days after the revelation, Matthias announced he had to travel to the country's interior to evaluate a rural property the company was considering buying. It was a trip he could have delegated, but both he and Luciana knew they needed to escape the mansion's tension and the family's speculative gazes. The journey was long, crossing landscapes that gradually transformed from urban to rural. Golden wheat fields stretched to the horizon, occasionally interrupted by small towns that seemed to exist in a different time dimension. They arrived at Serene Valley at sunset, a town so small it barely deserved a dot on the map. The inn where they would stay turned out to be a converted family home, run by an elderly couple who received them with the uninhibited warmth typical of places where everyone is neighbors. "A honeymoon couple," exclaimed Doña Mercedes, the owner, with a smile that wrinkled her entire face. "How romantic, coming to our little town for your special trip." Matthias and Luciana exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had booked separate rooms, but Doña Mercedes seemed to automatically assume they would want to share. "We have the romantic suite available," the lady continued, not catching the signals. "Mountain view canopy bed, it's perfect for lovebirds." "Mom, we actually prefer—" Matthias began. "Separate rooms, no," Don Ramiro, the husband, interrupted. "That brings bad luck to young marriages. My Mercedes and I have been married 52 years. We know about these things." Before they could protest further, they were practically pushed toward a charming room with windows framing purple mountains under the sunset sky. A large bed with hand-embroidered sheets dominated the space. When the door closed behind the hosts, Matthias and Luciana stood staring at the bed, as if it were a dangerous animal. "I can sleep on the floor," he offered. "Don't be ridiculous. It's big enough for 2 adults who can maintain their distance." "Are you sure?" Luciana sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "Matthias, we were foolish enough to fall in love in the middle of this mess. I think we can survive sharing a bed without complicating things more than they already are." That night, the town organized an impromptu celebration. Apparently, visitors' arrival was sufficient excuse for a party. There was live music with out-of-tune but enthusiastic guitars, homemade food served on mismatched plates, and spontaneous dancing under a sky so full of stars it seemed unreal. The locals, knowing nothing about corporate empires or complicated inheritances, simply saw a young couple and assumed love. And there was something liberating in that, in being able to be just Matthias and Luciana without surnames or expectations. "Dance!" someone shouted, and before they could protest, they were pushed toward the center of the cleared space, serving as a dance floor. The music was slow, a folk song about lost and found loves. Matthias placed his hands on Luciana's waist carefully, as if she were something fragile. She placed hers on his shoulders, maintaining a respectable distance between their bodies. But as the song continued, as the other dancers swirled around them laughing and singing, the distance diminished, centimeter by centimeter, until Luciana could feel the warmth of his chest against hers, until his breath brushed her hair. "I missed you," Matthias murmured. "These 3 days, even living in the same house, I missed you." "Me too," she admitted, "but missing doesn't solve our problems." "I know. But being here away from all that reminds me why this is worth fighting for." Luciana looked up, finding his grey eyes softened by the torchlight. "What if it's not enough? What if love doesn't conquer all practical complications?" "Then at least we tried," he responded. "At least we don't spend the rest of our lives wondering what if." The song ended, replaced by a more cheerful one that made the crowd burst into more animated movements. Matthias and Luciana retreated to a bench on the perimeter, watching the locals celebrate with the kind of uninhibited joy that only comes from lives without urban complications. "We could stay," Luciana said suddenly. "What?" "Here, this town. You could give up everything. I could open a small cafe, you could. I don't know, raise goats or something." She laughed at her own fantasy. "We'd just be 2 people without complicated pasts, building something simple." Mattia studied her profile, illuminated by fire and stars. Would that make you happy? Luciana considered the question honestly. I don't know. Maybe. But I also know you'd be giving up something you love, something your grandfather built and trusted you to protect, and eventually that sacrifice would become resentment. What about your sacrifices? You're trapped in a marriage that must last 5 years, so I don't lose everything. I'm not trapped, Luciana corrected gently. Trapped implies lack of choice. I chose this, even with all its complications. The question is, do we keep choosing it? Before Matias could respond, Don Ramiro approached with glasses of a homemade liquor that smelled strong enough to strip paint. Toast to love, he insisted. They toasted, the liquid burning their throats but warming something deeper. And as the party continued around them, Matias took Luciana's hand under the table, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was simultaneously promise and question. Later, in the room with its intimidating bed and windows open to the night, they prepared for sleep with the discomfort of teenagers. Matias changed in the bathroom, Luciana behind an improvised screen. When they were finally in bed, each glued to their respective edge, the distance between them seemed both minimal and vast. Luciana, Matias said in the darkness. Yes? If you had to choose between your absolute freedom and this complicated marriage, what would you choose? There was a long silence before she responded. I think I already chose. The day I decided your nightly conversations were worth more than my carefully constructed solitude. The day I realized your smile was more important than my fierce independence. I already made my choice, Matias. The question is, did you make yours? I made it the night I heard you sing, he responded. It just took me a long time to understand it. In the darkness, without seeing each other, they simultaneously moved toward the center of the bed. When their hands met, they intertwined them. When their bodies touched, there was nothing sexual about it, just the profound comfort of two people who had decided to face storms together. 5 years is a long time, Luciana murmured. Or not enough, Matias responded, depending on how we live them. They fell asleep like that, intertwined but dressed, intimate but chaste, two people who had begun as strangers with a contract and had become something much more complicated and beautiful. And outside, under a blanket of stars that cities never see, the universe kept silent, waiting to see what they would choose when they returned to the real world with all its demands and complications. Because love in a vacuum is easy, love under pressure is where true choices are tested. The return to the city was like diving into icy water. Reality hit them in layers. First the urgent emails on Matias's phone, then the missed calls from his assistant, finally the news waiting in the morning newspaper. Santoro Air faces family lawsuit. Younger brother challenges marriage validity. Sebastian hadn't been idle during their absence. He had hired aggressive lawyers and filed a formal lawsuit alleging marriage fraud. Worse still, he had leaked the most sordid details to the press: the money transfers, Luciana's employment history, the suspicious circumstances of the sudden marriage. This is bad, Eduardo said when he met with Matias in his office the day after their return. Shareholders are nervous. Other families are speculating, and your brother is painting this as if you defrauded the entire family. Is the company at risk? Not yet, but if this drags on, if your marriage's validity remains under public scrutiny, then yes. Uncertainty destroys stock value faster than any real loss. Matias ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. What do you suggest? There are 2 options, Eduardo leaned forward. Option 1, you fight this with everything you have. You hire the best lawyers, produce evidence that your marriage has become genuine, demonstrate that Sebastian is motivated by greed, not justice. And the second option? You voluntarily renounce the inheritance. You establish a trust that distributes it according to the will's original terms. You divorce Luciana cleanly, and you maintain your intact reputation. You lose the fortune, but keep business respect. And Luciana in all this? Eduardo paused, choosing his words carefully. Matias, I've been your friend for 15 years. I've seen how this woman changed you. But I need to ask you, If there were no inheritance at stake, if Sebastian had never filed this lawsuit, would you still be married to her? It was the question Matthias had been asking himself since they saw the newspapers. Yes, he responded without hesitation. Without a doubt, yes. Then you have your answer. You fight, not for the money, but for the right to choose your own life. Meanwhile, Luciana faced her own battles. She had gone to visit her mother, hoping to find comfort, but instead found Elena reading the same newspapers with tears in her eyes. "Is it true?" her mother asked. "Did all this start as a transaction?" Luciana couldn't lie, not now. "Yes, Mum, it started that way." Elena closed her eyes, the pain evident on her face. "Then my treatment was bought with your dignity." "It was bought with a decision I made freely," Luciana corrected, kneeling next to her mother's chair. "And yes, it started as a transaction, but it became something much more important. I fell in love with him, Mom, really genuinely in love. And him. Does he love you, or does he just need you to pretend for 5 years?" It was the question that also tormented Luciana. "I think he loves me. But with everything at stake, how can I be sure? How can I separate his real feelings from his need to keep the inheritance?" Elena took her daughter's hands. "Do you remember what your grandmother always told you? That the heart knows truths the mind takes years to accept. What does your heart tell you, my girl?" Luciana closed her eyes, searching for that internal truth. "It tells me he's real, that what we have, complicated and tangled as it is genuine. But it also tells me I'm a coward for needing external proof of that." "You're not a coward for wanting certainty," Elena said softly, "but sometimes faith is all we have." That night, Matthias and Luciana met in the library, their safe space in the middle of the storm. Both looked exhausted, carrying the weight of decisions that would affect not only their lives, but those of thousands of employees, family, and the memory of an old man who had tried to manipulate fate from his grave. "I talked to Eduardo," Matthias began. "He says I should fight this." "I talked to my mother," Luciana responded. "She says I should trust my heart." "And what does your heart say?" Luciana walked toward the window, looking at the city lights. "My heart says confusing things. It says, I love you. It also says I'm afraid. It says I want to stay. It also says every day I remain. You're losing something. Freedom. Options. The ability to choose a path without being chained to this mess." Matthias approached, standing behind her but not touching her. "What if I told you I have a plan?" "What kind of plan?" "One that solves both problems. One that gives us certainty." Luciana turned, studying his face. "Explain." "We're going to do what you said in Serene Valley. We're going to start over. Completely. I tear up the original contract. I voluntarily renounce any claim to the inheritance conditioned on marriage. I let Sebastian and the cousins divide it. And then, free from that pressure, free from those doubts, I ask you properly, will you marry me? For real this time, not for money or inheritances, but because we choose to build a life together." Luciana looked at him, incredulous. "You'd give up all that? Thousands of millions, your grandfather's empire?" "My grandfather wanted me to be happy, and I discovered happiness isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in nightly conversations and dances under the stars and the sound of your voice singing when you think no one's listening." "Matthias, that's beautiful and foolish in equal measure. What about the employees? The company?" "I keep my position as CEO of the operational division. I only lose majority control of the shares. I can still protect jobs, just without the weight of thousands of millions in personal inheritance." "And your family? Sebastian winning?" "Sebastian wins money. I win something much more valuable. The certainty that when I wake up every morning next to my wife, it's because she chose to be there, not because a contract or inheritance forced her." Luciana felt tears burning her eyes. "It's too much. You're giving up too much for me." "I'm not giving up anything." Matthias finally touched her, taking her hands. "I'm choosing. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what really matters instead of what's expected or practical. I'm choosing you. What if I say no? What if I say I can't live with the guilt of costing you thousands of millions? Then I respect your decision and still renounce the inheritance, Because this isn't emotional bribery, Luciana. I'm not saying, stay with me or I lose everything. I'm saying I'm going to do the right thing anyway, and then when all that pressure disappears, I hope you still choose me. Luciana turned away, needing space to think. Everything in her life had trained her for distrust, to see traps in beautiful promises. But looking at Matthias, seeing the raw vulnerability in his eyes, she felt something break inside her, the last defensive wall she had built after her father left. I have a counter-proposal, she finally said. I'm listening. You fight Sebastian, not for the money but for the principle. You prove our marriage, however complicated it started, became real. You win on your own terms, and then, when everything has settled, when we've proven we can survive together under the worst pressure, then you ask me again, and then I'll give you my answer. Matthias studied her, trying to understand. Why? Because I don't want you to give up for me. I want you to fight, not for money, but for the right to choose your own path. And I want to prove to both of us that what we have can survive the worst storm. If we're still together on the other side, then I'll know it's real. It was, Matthias realized, the bravest thing she could have said. She wasn't taking the easy path, the clean renunciation that would end all controversy. She was choosing the harder path, staying and fighting, knowing every day would be public scrutiny of their relationship. Are you sure? I'm not sure of anything, Luciana admitted, but I'm willing to try. Are you? By way of response, Matthias drew her to him, embracing her with a fierceness that spoke of relief and hope and fear in equal measure. Then we fight, he murmured against her hair. Together. Together, she repeated. And so, in the middle of lawsuits and public scrutiny and whispered doubts, two people who had begun as strangers with a contract chose something much harder, choosing each other despite everything. The battle ahead would be brutal, but for the first time, both knew with certainty they were fighting it for the right reasons. The following 2 months were a hell of legal battles and media scrutiny. Sebastian had hired a team of aggressive lawyers who attacked from all angles. The time between meeting and marriage was suspiciously short. The financial transfers indicated transaction. The fact that Luciana kept working suggested she desperately needed money. Matthias hired his own team, led by the city's fiercest lawyer, a woman named Victoria Reyes, who had made a career dismantling fraud cases and who saw in this trial the opportunity to defend something genuine for once in her life. Their argument is financial, Victoria explained during a strategy meeting. Our counter-argument needs to be emotional. We need to show that, yes, the marriage began unconventionally, but it evolved into something genuine. We need testimonies from people who have observed your relationship. We need evidence of real intimacy, not just transactional. What kind of evidence? Luciana asked uneasily. Text messages, emails, photos, anything demonstrating real affection between you. Matthias and Luciana exchanged uncomfortable glances. Their phones were full of messages, but most were practical coordinates about events or discussions about the case. The few personal conversations they had occurred face-to-face. In those nightly conversations they never documented. We don't have much, Matthias admitted. Victoria frowned. How do you not have digital proof of your relationship? Because we don't live our love on social media, Luciana responded with frustration. Because our real moments happen in midnight conversations and impromptu dances and comfortable silences, things that don't photograph well. I understand, Victoria said more gently, but we live in a digital era. Judges want tangible evidence, not just pretty words about connections. The solution came from an unexpected source. Doña Mercedes and Don Ramiro, the couple from Serene Valley, who sent an extensive letter with photos taken during Matthias and Luciana's visit. The images showed moments they had forgotten. Luciana laughing while Matthias tried to dance, Matthias looking at Luciana with adoration while she talked with the locals, both sitting under the stars with their hands intertwined. This is gold, Victoria declared. Authenticity captured without intention, exactly what we need. But Sebastian and his team didn't sit still. They began contacting people from Luciana's past, former employers, co-workers, neighbors. They were building a profile of someone desperate for money, willing to do anything to escape poverty. The preliminary hearing was brutal. Luciana had to sit on a cold stand, while Sebastian's lawyers interrogated her about every aspect of her life, her debts, her multiple jobs, her mother's illness, Matias's proposal. "Isn't it true, Miss Mendez, that you agreed to marry my client specifically because you needed money for your mother's treatment?" "Yes," Luciana responded honestly. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Matias, sitting behind the defense table, tensed every muscle, resisting the impulse to intervene. "And isn't it true that, in fact, you received a substantial sum of money immediately after the marriage?" "Yes." "And isn't it true you worked cleaning Mr. Santoro's offices before this convenient marriage?" "It wasn't convenient," Luciana corrected, her voice firm. "It was complicated. And yes, I worked cleaning his building. Is there something shameful about honest work?" "No one's suggesting shame, Miss Mendez. We're only pointing out the obvious power imbalance. A rich man, a desperate woman, an obvious transaction." "Objection." Victoria stood up. "Counsel is testifying, not questioning." "Sustained," the judge said. "Counsel, ask questions, not make statements." But the damage was done. The afternoon headlines screamed, "Heir accused of buying desperate wife." That night, Luciana collapsed at the mansion. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "Every day they tear me apart on that stand. Every question implies I sold my soul. And the worst part is it started being true." Matias held her, feeling completely helpless. "You can stop it. You can withdraw any time." "And leave you to fight alone?" She pulled away, wiping tears with fury. "No, we said together, and I meant it. I just need you to remind me why we're doing this." "Because what we have is worth every minute of pain," he responded with intensity. "Because when this ends, no one can tell us we didn't fight for it. And because I'm more sure of my love for you than anything else in my life." The following week brought an unexpected twist. Adriana Santoro requested to testify not for Sebastian, as he had assumed, but for Matias and Luciana. "I've been married twice," she declared from the stand with her elegant bearing. "My first marriage was a perfect arrangement. Appropriate families, clear contracts, mutual expectations. It was civilized, efficient, and completely empty. My second marriage to my children's father was a scandal. I married a man below my social class. My family disapproved. Society whispered. But it was real." She paused, looking directly at her younger son. "Sebastian, you've confused the beginning of a story with the entire narrative." "Yes, Matias's marriage began unconventionally. But you know what else began unconventionally? Most of the great loves throughout history. Romeo and Juliet, Elizabeth and Darcy, my own marriage to your father. Love rarely arrives clean and convenient." She turned to the judge. "I've observed my son during these 4 months. I've seen how Luciana challenges him, makes him laugh, makes him think. I've seen how he looks at her when he thinks no one notices. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, what these two have is real, complicated, and deeply imperfect. Exactly as true love should be." Adriana's testimony changed the trial's tone. Suddenly the narrative was no longer rich man buys wife but two people finding love in a non-traditional way. More testimonies followed. Rosa from the cafe testified about how Matias came to sit in a corner just to be near Luciana while she worked. Matias's colleagues testified about how he had changed, less cold, more human, truly happy for the first time in years. Even Elena, Luciana's mother, testified about phone conversations where her daughter spoke about Matias with the kind of affectionate confusion that only comes from real love. Finally, Matias and Luciana testified. Separately first, telling their version of the story with brutal honesty about how it began and how it evolved. "Yes, I proposed a business agreement," Matias admitted, "and she accepted it for practical reasons. Neither of us expected this. Neither of us planned to fall in love. But the heart doesn't respect plans or contracts. It just happens." When Luciana testified, she spoke about her fears, her defensive walls, and how Matias had patiently torn them down. "I didn't fall in love with his money," she said, looking directly at Sebastian. I fell in love with his terrible laugh when he tries to tell jokes, with the way he worries too much about doing the right thing, with how he challenges me to be brave when I'd prefer to be cowardly. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy the way my heart races when I hear him come home. The judge's ruling came 2 weeks later. The court found that, although the marriage had begun with transactional elements, there was sufficient evidence that it had evolved into a genuine union. Sebastian's lawsuit was dismissed, but with a warning. The Santoros must submit to annual reviews for the next 3 years to ensure the marriage continued being substantial. It was a victory but tainted, and Sebastian, publicly humiliated and financially defeated by legal fees, retreated with a look of pure hatred that promised this wasn't over. But for Matthias and Luciana, weary battle survivors, it was enough. They had fought and won the right to choose each other. Now they just had to live that choice. The months after the trial were strangely quiet, like the silence following a storm. Matthias and Luciana moved carefully around each other, two people who had been publicly disarmed and now needed to relearn how to be together without audiences or lawyers watching every interaction. "Do you think we really know each other?" Luciana asked one night during dinner. They had fallen into the habit of quiet dinners at home, avoiding restaurants where curious stares followed every movement. After all this, all the drama and scrutiny, do we know who we really are as a couple? Matthias considered the question carefully. "I know you like your coffee with too much sugar, that you sing your grandmother's songs when you're happy and go silent when you're sad, that you have a half-moon-shaped birthmark on your left shoulder, and that your real laugh, not the polite one, sounds like music." Luciana smiled softly. "And I know you work late when you're avoiding something that worries you, that you talk to your grandfather's photo when making difficult decisions, that you prefer cold showers in the mornings, and that your crooked smile appears only when you're genuinely surprised." "Then maybe we know each other better than we think," Matthias said, "just not in traditional ways." They decided, on Victoria Reyes's advice and their own need for healing, to do something radical. Start over. Not legally, the marriage remained intact. But emotionally, they wiped the slate clean. "First date," Matthias announced one Saturday, arriving at her room with wildflowers, not expensive roses. No agendas, no pressure, no audiences, just you and me learning to be normal. Normalcy turned out to be complicated for two people who had lived under intense scrutiny. Their first date was at a small cinema in a neighborhood where no one would recognize them. They sat in the darkness sharing popcorn, and for the first time in months they were just two people enjoying a terrible movie and laughing at its absurdities. "This is nice," Luciana murmured, her head resting on his shoulder. "This is what it should have been from the beginning," Matthias responded. Other dates followed, walks through parks, visits to small museums, afternoons cooking together at the mansion, while they burned dinner and ended up ordering takeout. Each experience was a new layer of understanding, a crack in the defenses both still maintained. But not everything was repair. There were nights of frustration where they argued about small things that were really substitutes for bigger fears. There were uncomfortable silences when both wanted to say, "I love you," but the words stuck. Too big, too real, too risky. The breaking point came 6 months after the trial. Matthias came home and found Luciana in the garden, crying with a letter in her hands. "What happened?" "My mother," she said with a broken voice. "The treatment worked. The doctors say she's in remission. She's going to be okay." Matthias held her, confused. "That's wonderful. Why are you crying?" "Because it's over," Luciana sobbed. "The original reason I accepted this marriage, the why of all this, no longer exists. Mom is saved. The debt is paid. I no longer have an excuse to stay." Matthias pulled back, looking at her with a mixture of pain and understanding. "Do you need an excuse?" "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long I had this clear mission, save Mom. That justified every difficult decision, every compromise. But now that it's over, I have to face the truth. I stayed not because I had to, but because I wanted to, and that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because wanting to stay is more vulnerable than having to stay," Luciana explained. "Having to stay gives you emotional protection. Wanting to stay means you chose this, that if it goes wrong you have no one else to blame. Matthias sat next to her on the garden bench, taking her hands. Luciana, during the past year, I've learned something about fear and love. They come together. You can't have one without the other. Loving means risking loss. But living without love, protecting yourself from pain, is losing anyway, just more slowly. What if I fail you? What if I'm not enough? What if you're exactly enough? What if what we have, imperfect and complicated, is exactly what we both need? Luciana closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. I'm so afraid of falling completely in love with you, because if I lose you, if this ends, there won't be enough pieces of me to pick up after. Then don't lose it, Matthias said fiercely. Stay, not because a contract says you must, not because your mother needs treatment, not for any practical reason. Stay because you chose this beautiful mess, because you decided I'm worth the risk, because against all logic and probability we fell in love. We fell in love? Luciana asked, her voice barely a whisper. I fell in love with you, Matthias corrected. Completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. And I've been waiting for you to be ready to hear it without running away. Luciana looked at him, seeing beyond the words to the truth in his eyes. And finally, after months of protection and fear and carefully constructed walls, she let the defenses fall. I love you, she said, the words coming out like confession and promise. I've loved you for months, but I was too scared to admit it, too scared that if I said it out loud, the universe would take you from me. The universe will have to go through me first, Matthias responded, drawing her into a kiss that was sweet and salty with tears and perfect in its imperfection. When they separated, both were smiling through tears. So are you staying? Matthias asked. No excuses, no practical reasons, just because you want to? I'm staying, Luciana confirmed, because I want to, because I love you, because building something with you, even with all the risks, is better than being safe and alone. That night marked a fundamental shift. No more performances, no more guards, just two people who had begun as strangers, had survived public storms and private fears, and had chosen, against all odds, to build something real together. The following months were easier and harder at the same time. Easier because honesty replaced performance. Harder because real love demands constant vulnerability, continuous work, and the willingness to choose each other every day, especially on the days when it's hardest. But they did it. Day after day, choice after choice, they built something no contract could have specified. A true couple, forged in fire and tested by scrutiny, stronger for all the cracks. And as the first year of their official marriage came to an end, both knew the next 4 years, required by the will but chosen by the heart, would be the real test. But for the first time, both were ready for that test. Together. True love isn't finding the perfect person, but learning to see perfectly an imperfect person. The small chapel in Serene Valley was decorated with wildflowers, the same ones Matthias had picked for Luciana on their first real date. There was no press, no crowds, only the people who truly mattered. Elena, now fully recovered and radiant. Adriana, who had cried openly when she received the invitation, some close friends from both worlds, and of course Doña Mercedes and Don Ramiro, who had insisted on preparing all the food for the celebration. 5 years had passed since the hasty civil marriage in a government office, 5 years of growth, challenges, joys, and shared pain. The will's terms were officially fulfilled. The inheritance was secure. And Matthias and Luciana had decided, with the blessing of a judge who had followed their case with interest, to renew their vows the way they should have taken them from the beginning, for love, not for contract. Luciana wore a simple dress, white with handmade lace by her mother, nothing like the designer creations of her first marriage. Her hair fell in natural waves, adorned with the wildflowers that were now their shared symbol. There was no professional makeup or stylist, just her, genuine and radiant. Matthias stood at the front of the chapel, dressed in a simple but elegant suit without the corporate armor of his old self. When he saw Luciana walk down the aisle on her mother's arm, his eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. The officiant, the same village priest who had known them during their visit years ago, smiled warmly. We're here today to witness not a beginning, but a renewed choice. Matthias and Luciana have been legally married for 5 years, but today they choose to seal themselves emotionally in ways that transcend any legal document. Matthias took Luciana's hands, his vows handwritten on a paper he had reviewed 100 times, but now ignored, speaking from the heart. Luciana, 5 years ago, I proposed a business agreement to you. It was the most calculated and impersonal decision I could have made. It was also, unknowingly, the best decision of my life. Not because it got me an inheritance, but because it got me you. His voice broke slightly. You taught me that real strength isn't in walls, but in vulnerability. That love isn't transaction, but transformation. That the most important conversations happen in the darkness of midnight, and that your laugh is the most beautiful sound I'll ever hear. I spent 5 years learning to love you. I want to spend the rest of my life perfecting that skill. Luciana smiled through her own tears, squeezing his hands. Matthias, 5 years ago I accepted your proposal out of desperation. I needed to save my mother and would sell anything, even my future, to do it. I thought I was making a sacrifice. I didn't understand I was receiving a gift. She wiped tears with the back of her hand. You taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, that love can exist even when it started as something else, that second chances are real, and that songs sung in darkness eventually find ears that appreciate them. I can't imagine my life without your terrible jokes, your midnight worries, or the way you look at me as if I were the most valuable thing you possess. 5 years were enough to fall in love. The rest of my life will be enough to love you completely. They exchanged new rings, simple compared to the elaborate bands of the original marriage. These bore simple inscriptions, chosen, not obligated. By the power vested in me not only by the state, but by the testimony of this community that has seen you grow together, the priest said, I declare you again and truly husband and wife. You may seal it with a kiss. And they did, a kiss that was simultaneously their first and their 1,000th, fresh with promise and familiar with earned intimacy. The small chapel exploded in applause and cheers. The celebration that followed was everything their first wedding wasn't: warm, chaotic, filled with genuine laughter and spontaneous dancing. Eduardo, Matthias's partner, who had become a true friend, gave an emotional toast about how witnessing this relationship had restored his faith in real love. Eleanor shared embarrassing stories from Luciana's childhood that made her blush. Adriana, in a surprising move, sang a song her husband used to sing to her, dedicating it to the new couple. Even Sebastian, who had been invited in a gesture of reconciliation, appeared briefly. His presence was uncomfortable, the wound still too fresh, but he extended his hand to Matthias with a stiff nod that was as close to an apology as he could offer. Brother, he said simply. Brother, Matthias responded, accepting the hand. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Matthias and Luciana escaped the celebration, walking toward the same place where they had danced under the stars years ago. Do you regret it? Luciana asked, leaning against him. Everything we went through to get here. I don't regret a single second, Matthias responded, kissing her hair. Every difficult moment brought us to this moment. What about you? I only regret one thing, she said thoughtfully. What? That I didn't hear you sing soon enough. We could have saved so much drama if we'd just had an honest conversation from the beginning. Matthias laughed, that sound she had learned to love completely. Where's the adventure in that? Besides, then we wouldn't have such an interesting story for our grandchildren. Grandchildren? Luciana raised an eyebrow. You're getting ahead of yourself. We have time, Matthias said, drawing her closer. We have all the time in the world. The contract is over, the terms are fulfilled, and the only thing binding us now is choice. Every day, I choose you, and I hope every day you choose me. Every day, Luciana promised, even on the bad days, especially on the bad days. They stayed like that as the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed their confusion years ago, now witnesses to their certainty. The journey had been long, winding, and sometimes brutally difficult, but it had brought them to this moment, two people who had found each other in darkness and had chosen to build light together. Epilogue 10 years later. Santoro Tower had grown, now part of a business complex that employed 12,000 people. But on the 42nd floor, a tradition had remained. Every night, the CEO still occasionally worked late, and when he did, his wife accompanied him. Luciana no longer cleaned the floors, of course. She now directed the Mendes Santoro Foundation, dedicated to helping families with catastrophic illnesses, ensuring no one had to make the desperate choices she had faced. But some nights, when she visited Matias in his office, she still sang those songs her grandmother had taught her, and he still stopped to listen, fascinated as the first time. They had 2 children now. Andres, 7, who had inherited his father's business mind and his mother's fierce heart, and Sophia, 5, who sang constantly and reminded them why songs matter. Elena lived with them, her health completely restored, dedicating her days to teaching her grandchildren the same lessons she had taught Luciana. That dignity isn't measured in possessions, that love is stronger than fear, and that second chances are gifts that shouldn't be wasted. Adriana visited weekly, having found in Luciana not just a daughter-in-law but a true daughter, someone who understood that love transcends class divisions and social expectations. Even Sebastian, after years of therapy and his own journey of self-discovery, had reconciled with his brother. They would never be as close as in childhood, but they had found mutual respect and occasional peace. The mansion was filled with noise now, children's laughter, animated conversations, the beautiful chaos of a real family, far from the empty halls and cold silences of when Matias lived alone. One night, after putting the children to bed, Matias and Luciana found themselves in the library, their sacred space now filled with children's books alongside business tomes and romance novels. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" Luciana asked, snuggling against him on the sofa they had replaced 3 times, but always kept in the same place. "All the time," Matias admitted. "I think about the arrogance of believing I could control something as wild as love. I think about how close we came to losing this through pride and fear. I think about the desperation that led me to say yes," Luciana said, "and how that desperation transformed into the best decision of my life. It's strange, isn't it? How the most important things often start in the least likely ways." "Not strange," Matias corrected. "Perfect. Nothing about us was conventional or expected. Why should our beginning have been?" Luciana laughed, that sound that still made him smile after all these years. "Your grandfather would be so smug right now. I know. He probably planned all this from beyond the grave." Matias paused. "You know what? I should thank him. That absurd will clause was the most frustrating and most beautiful thing he could have left me." "It wasn't the clause," Luciana said softly. "It was the choice. The clause brought us together, but choice kept us together. Every day for 10 years we chose this. We chose the hard work of real love over the ease of loneliness. We chose vulnerability over protection. We chose to trust when it would have been easier to doubt. And we'd choose again," Matias added. "Tomorrow, the day after, every day until we run out of days." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes after years of deep conversations and mutual understanding. Outside, the city glowed with thousands of lights, each representing a life, a story, a possibility. And in that library, filled with memories and shared history, 2 people who had begun as strangers with a contract decided, once again, to choose each other. Because that's what real love does. It continues choosing day after day, year after year, through joys and pains, triumphs and failures, until the choices become something bigger than any contract or promise. They become shared life, legacy, love.